testament to the year 1885, a settlement forever altered by the iron arrival of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. For 4 relentless years, the trains had been carving through the dry prairie, and in that span, the station platform had assumed the rugged character of a place built for sheer utility rather than comfort. The cedar siding had long surrendered to the severe elements, weathering into an ashen, ghost-like grey under the punishing plains sun. The heavy iron rails possessed a stubborn memory, holding tight to the blistering daytime heat long after the sun finally dipped below the distant horizon. Whenever the Baldwin locomotive thundered into the bustling station, its iron belly burning thick Kansas coal, it unleashed a violent plume of black smoke that rolled heavily over the passenger cars. It completely smothered the wooden platform in the overpowering industrial stench of scorched metal and sharp creosote bleeding from the treated oak ties. It was a dense, physical odor that clung desperately to wool and cotton, refusing to wash out easily. Yet Wilson Kincaid seemed entirely unbothered by the suffocating atmosphere. Every single Friday afternoon, roughly 8 minutes before the hour of 4, he would calmly tie his tired horse to the weathered hitching post outside the station building and purchase a simple platform ticket for 5 cents, ensuring he always had the exact change ready in his weathered hand. He always wore his absolute best shirt for these weekly vigils, the fabric meticulously starched. On unpredictable occasions, he arrived bearing a clutch of vibrant wildflowers, gathered along the southern fence line of his ranch, bringing a flash of color to the bleak station. He claimed the second bench from the eastern edge of the wooden platform, sitting with the unyielding stillness of carved stone. When the eastbound train finally screeched into the station at 12 minutes past 4, Wilson observed the disembarking passengers with piercing anticipation. He studied the weary women draped in traveling clothes, the anxious men wrestling with leather cases, and the frantic families navigating a chaotic sea of heavy trunks. He searched every single face with the heartbreaking, patient intensity of a man who knows precisely whose silhouette he is desperate to find. When the platform emptied and the iron train churned onward, he remained seated. He watched the tracks trailing eastward until they curved around the hillside and vanished. Only then would he silently mount his horse and begin the lonely ride home. The community of Larkspur Junction never dared to question him about this ritual. Wilson had successfully ranched 300 head of cattle for 15 grueling years, and his neighbors implicitly understood that his weekly mourning on that specific bench was a highly private sorrow they possessed absolutely no right to ever disturb. The new ticket clerk had been manning the window at the station for barely 6 weeks when she truly began to study the silent rancher. Her name was Mara Ellison, a quiet woman who had recently fled the crushing memories of Wichita after burying both of her beloved parents during a single, merciless winter. The dual losses of her father in January and her mother in March had compounded into a suffocating grief, a heavy burden she was still struggling to carry. She had abruptly accepted the vacant position simply because it offered an escape. Being surrounded by complete strangers in an unfamiliar prairie town felt significantly easier than enduring the sympathetic whispers of old neighbors. From her isolated vantage point, Mara sold fares, logged the daily arrivals in the heavy ledger, and kept the chalkboard schedules flawlessly updated. She watched a transient world come and go, but the stoic man on the second bench captured her attention on her very first Friday. By her 4th week, she had memorized his name from the ticket logs and found herself instinctively anticipating his arrival at 8 minutes to 4. She observed his unwavering routine, the distant gratitude he offered, and his devastating focus on the arriving trains. Then came the miserable 5th Friday, an afternoon drowned in a relentless, freezing downpour. Wilson arrived exactly on time, wearing his finest shirt as the heavy rain rapidly soaked through the thin fabric directly to his skin. He deliberately took his customary place on the weather-beaten wooden bench, allowing the freezing rain to wash over him without flinching. He watched the eastbound train arrive and empty its passengers into the storm, sitting completely paralyzed in the miserable downpour for his usual few minutes of silent reflection, even after the massive iron machine had vanished. Watching this heartbreaking display of unyielding devotion from the dry safety of her window, Mara finally made a definitive choice. She decisively closed her service window, stepped out onto the drenched platform boards, and walked directly over to sit right beside him in the harsh rain. "Who are you waiting for?" she asked, her quiet voice cutting through the rhythmic drumming of the storm. Wilson did not immediately reply. Having observed him carefully, she innately understood that he was a methodical man who weighed the gravity of his words before releasing them. Slowly, he reached deep into his soaked coat and retrieved an incredibly old, fragile platform ticket. The delicate paper was worn dangerously soft at the creases from years of endless folding, serving as a desperate talisman rather than a receipt. He held it tenderly. "My wife," he finally whispered into the storm. "Her name was Evelyn. When we first married, she traveled to care for her dying mother. Every single Friday, she took this eastbound train home to me for the weekend. I came right here to meet her, this exact bench. She always knew precisely where to find me, because I never once moved." Mara sat patiently beside him as the freezing rain soaked through her own modest clothing, respectfully waiting for him to navigate the painful memories. "When her mother eventually passed away," Wilson continued, his deep voice painfully hollow, "she came home to the ranch for good. But we faithfully kept coming back here on Friday afternoons, just sitting side by side and watching the locomotives roll through. She always told me that this very platform was the first place she truly understood that someone in this harsh world was waiting specifically for her." He delicately folded the ancient ticket and tucked it safely back into his pocket like a sacred relic. "She died 3 years ago, a sudden fever that took her in just 12 days, but I kept coming back." Mara looked down at the dark, waterlogged cedar boards beneath their feet. The heavy scent of coal smoke and sharp creosote hung heavily in the damp air. She silently contemplated the sheer, devastating weight of his unyielding loyalty, the unimaginable emotional cost of blindly returning to an empty bench week after agonizing week for 3 long years. "You know she won't ever be on that train," she gently observed. "I know," he admitted softly, "because this is the absolute last place my mind can still vividly remember her joyfully running toward me. She always sprinted the final 20 yards. She claimed walking was simply too slow." Overwhelmed by his vulnerability, Mara murmured a deeply sincere apology as they sat quietly together in the relentless rain. The following Friday afternoon, before the striking of 3 o'clock, Mara made a deliberate choice. She brewed a fresh pot on the small cast-iron stove tucked away in the station's cramped back room and carefully carried a steaming cup out to the second bench. She left it there, completely unannounced, just moments before Wilson arrived for his unwavering vigil. She had debated the simple gesture for 4 long days, ultimately deciding that tiny, unspoken kindnesses were the only things that truly mattered in a world overflowing with profound grief. When Wilson arrived at exactly 8 minutes to 4, he instantly noticed the ceramic cup resting on the weathered wood. He looked intently toward the ticket window, but Mara was busily attending to a departing passenger and purposefully avoided his piercing gaze. He sat down heavily and drank the strong coffee in complete silence. After the mighty train had come and gone, and he had sat for his customary minutes of solitary reflection, he slowly carried the empty cup back to her window. "Thank you," he rumbled, his voice rough with disuse. "It gets terribly cold waiting," she replied softly, keeping her eyes firmly fixed on the complicated schedule board. He held the empty cup for a long moment before asking how she knew to serve it entirely black, without a grain of sugar. "I guessed," she told him honestly. She had correctly deduced that he was absolutely not a man who required artificial sweetness added to things that didn't need it. The dark coffee silently appeared on the worn cedar bench every single Friday afternoon that followed. Mara deliberately refrained from joining him out in the biting air immediately, respectfully granting him the quiet sanctity of his platform and his cherished memories. Yet she acutely observed that by the 3rd week of her quiet offering, he lingered just a fraction longer after the rumbling eastbound departed, staring at the empty iron rails with a profoundly shifted expression that looked significantly less like agonizing waiting and much more like peaceful remembering. Unbeknownst to Mara, a devastating crisis had descended upon Wilson's isolated ranch in the weeks preceding his subtle transformation. A vicious lung sickness, the deadly precursor to a brutal northern winter that would soon decimate the vast cattle ranges from Kansas all the way to Montana, had abruptly infiltrated his south pasture. Having lost 11 head to the relentless disease, Wilson arrived at the station in early December, carrying the exhausting, solitary arithmetic of a desperate man who has single-handedly borne the crushing financial weight of a massive operation for 3 agonizing years. Sitting on the freezing platform with the hot coffee she had brewed, the desolate track suddenly felt far less like a haunting void and more like a warm place where he was truly known. Mara had purposefully withheld the bleak details of her own solitary existence, genuinely convinced that her quiet version of desperate loneliness paled in comparison to his profound tragedy. Having sacrificed the entirety of her adult life to the agonizing decline of her fragile parents in Wichita, she had abruptly found herself at 33 years old, standing completely alone in a hauntingly empty house. She had dutifully organized every passing year around the relentless needs of loved ones who were suddenly gone, leaving her entirely adrift. Seeking refuge in the stark anonymity of Larkspur Junction, she had resigned herself to forever watching vibrant life happen to other people from the safe side of a glass window. But one bitterly cold November Friday, she carried 2 steaming cups to the platform and finally sat beside him without any ceremony. As they watched the dwindling daylight, Wilson confessed that he had shown up at this very station before he even knew if his young wife would be on the train, bravely risking heartbreak for the mere possibility of her arrival. "I've never had anyone show up for me like that," Mara whispered into the freezing Kansas wind, suddenly realizing that her own existence had been entirely devoid of such fearless devotion, because she had always assumed the probability of genuine love was far too impossibly low. As the brutal prairie winter deepened, Wilson confessed the agonizing toll of managing the sprawling ranch entirely alone, speaking softly of the complex ledgers he now balanced in absolute silence after supper. Mara listened intently, her ink-stained fingers tightly clutching her porcelain cup, painfully recognizing the parallel emptiness mirroring her own secluded life. Then, in the icy depths of February, an official letter unexpectedly arrived from the sprawling Salina Junction station, offering a highly lucrative permanent position and a desperately needed fresh start. Paralyzed by the terrifying vulnerability of her blossoming connection with Wilson, she quickly surrendered to her deeply ingrained instinct to retreat and formally accepted the distant job in complete secrecy. On what was supposed to be her final Friday, she packed her modest carpet bag and strategically planned to board the evening train, completely vanishing before he could ever arrive. But destiny violently intervened. At exactly 2 minutes before 4, a slight delay caused by a broken pasture fence, Wilson strode through the station doors just as the massive Baldwin locomotive screeched into the platform, belching suffocating black smoke. He instantly froze, his piercing green eyes locking onto her travel bag, absorbing the devastating reality of her imminent and unannounced departure. He purposefully crossed the echoing wooden floor, ignoring the booming voice of the conductor calling for final boarding. "I spent 3 agonizing years helplessly waiting for a wonderful woman who tragically couldn't come back," Wilson stated, his voice completely steady yet trembling with unspoken emotion. "I absolutely refuse to spend the rest of my lonely life bitterly missing one who actually could have stayed." The heavy iron engine hissed violently behind them, but Mara remained perfectly paralyzed, staring at the extraordinary man who had faithfully bought a ticket every Friday without any guarantee of a return. Overwhelmed by the staggering courage of his desperate plea, she deliberately released her tight grip on the heavy carpet bag, allowing the noisy eastbound train to pull away without her. When the vibrant spring finally thawed the frozen Kansas plains, Wilson brought her out to the ranch. As she slowly walked through the meticulously organized kitchen and the vibrant, carefully tended garden, Mara profoundly understood that true love did not demand erasing the past. Evelyn had planted perennials that faithfully bloomed every single year, and Mara realized with absolute clarity that gracefully continuing the beautiful work started by another woman was its own fiercely unique and incredibly powerful form of enduring devotion. On a bright Friday in late May, Wilson made one final solitary pilgrimage to the bustling station. He gently placed a vibrant bouquet of wild prairie flowers upon the weathered cedar bench, silently honoring the vivid memory of Evelyn joyfully running toward him before permanently laying his tragic waiting to rest. They were beautifully married on a crisp September Saturday, fiercely determined to preserve Friday as a sacred memory rather than attempting to rewrite its profound history. Immediately after the simple ceremony, they walked hand in hand back to the deserted railway platform, sitting together on the very same scarred wooden bench where their unexpected salvation had miraculously blossomed. As the sweet smell of coal smoke drifted through the golden afternoon air, Mara softly intertwined her fingers with his, absolutely certain that Evelyn had always known Wilson would relentlessly show up for the people he cherished. The deep love they had all shared hadn't simply vanished into the uncaring earth, it had miraculously transformed, creating a powerful foundation for a brand new beginning. Mara Ellison had once believed her life was entirely over, but by courageously stepping out into the freezing rain to ask the right question, she had beautifully proven that sometimes the most profound love stories arise from the ashes of unimaginable grief. 3 years after that quiet September wedding, the Kincaid Ranch pulsed with a fundamentally different rhythm, a vibrant cadence that had slowly overwritten the terrible silence of Wilson's solitary mourning. The sprawling wooden house, originally constructed with an optimistic vision for a bustling family, finally echoed with the frantic, joyful footsteps of their energetic toddler son, William. The boy possessed Wilson's penetrating green eyes and Mara's quiet, observant patience, often sitting completely still in the tall prairie grass to watch the heavy steam locomotives chug distantly across the southern horizon. Mara had seamlessly integrated herself into the demanding life of the Kansas frontier, expanding Evelyn's original garden to include a massive, thriving vegetable patch that sustained them through the bitter winters. She had also taken over the complete management of the sprawling backyard poultry flock, implementing clever, practical homesteading strategies she had quietly developed through careful observation. Every morning after breakfast, she meticulously crushed the leftover eggshells into a fine, gritty powder, thoroughly mixing it back into the chickens' daily feed to ensure the laying hens received an abundance of essential calcium, a pragmatic cycle of renewal that perfectly mirrored the beautiful resurrection of her own deeply fulfilling life. The relentless rhythm of the seasons continued to shape the harsh landscape, but the suffocating loneliness that had once defined both of their separate lives was now completely eradicated by their shared burdens. When the brutal winter storms swept ferociously down from the northern territories, completely burying the sprawling grazing pastures under feet of unforgiving, blinding white snow, Wilson no longer sat alone at the rough-hewn kitchen table, staring blankly into the miserable darkness. Instead, Mara sat firmly beside him under the warm glow of the flickering oil lamp, her sharp mind effortlessly navigating the complicated ranch accounts and complex logistical arithmetic that Evelyn used to manage, proving her own distinct and invaluable partnership. On the rare, quiet Friday afternoons, when the blistering summer heat finally broke, they would hitch the sturdy wagon and make the familiar journey back into Larkspur Junction together. They no longer purchased platform tickets to wait for ghostly trains. Instead, they simply stood together near the bustling freight office, proudly watching their young son marvel at the massive Baldwin locomotives. They had built a beautiful, enduring sanctuary right over the devastating ashes of their pasts, firmly proving that profound love could always be wildly grown from the most unexpected and sorrowful beginnings. During the fourth brutal summer of their marriage, a catastrophic drought violently seized the unforgiving Kansas plains, aggressively threatening the delicate equilibrium they had so carefully constructed. The normally vibrant, rolling green pastures rapidly withered into a brittle, desolate expanse of cracked brown earth, completely starving the massive herd of their essential daily sustenance. The vital creeks that aggressively carved through the sprawling southern acreage slowly dwindled to pathetic, muddy trickles, forcing Wilson and his exhausted ranch hands to desperately haul heavy wooden barrels of water from the deepest reserve wells, just to keep the desperate cattle alive. Mara watched the exhausting, relentless labor from the shaded porch of the farmhouse, her heart breaking for her weary husband, who returned every single evening covered in a suffocating layer of pale dust and dried sweat. She proactively completely reorganized their entire household budget with surgical precision, ruthlessly cutting away absolutely every unnecessary luxury to ensure they could afford to purchase expensive imported grain from the eastern markets. She deliberately transformed their modest kitchen into a highly efficient staging ground, constantly brewing massive kettles of strong black coffee and baking dense, hearty loaves of sourdough bread to physically sustain the exhausted men working endlessly under the punishing sun. As the desperate, unforgiving month of August finally drew to a miserable close, a massive wall of dark, violent thunderstorms miraculously began to rapidly assemble along the distant western horizon, bringing a desperately needed surge of vibrant hope to the entirely exhausted homestead. Wilson had spent the entire morning frantically securing the heavy barn doors and meticulously checking the fragile perimeter fences, instinctively knowing that the impending torrential downpour would be violently chaotic after such a prolonged period of devastating dryness. When the heavy, freezing rain finally broke across the cracked prairie, completely shattering the oppressive, suffocating heat that had violently choked the barren landscape for endless months, Mara and Wilson stood proudly together on the covered wooden porch. They watched silently as the precious, life-giving water aggressively washed away the thick layers of accumulated dust, immediately transforming the dead, brittle grass back into a lush, vibrant green tapestry. Their young son laughed uncontrollably at the magnificent sound of the booming thunder, completely oblivious to the terrifying existential threat that had just narrowly bypassed their beloved ranch. It was in these incredibly fragile, fleeting moments of profound relief that Mara deeply understood the true, unyielding strength of the beautiful partnership they had so carefully constructed. In the quiet, deeply peaceful aftermath of the violent summer storms, the vibrant ranch returned to its beautifully steady, predictable rhythm, completely allowing the weary family to finally exhale and enjoy the cooler autumn air. One unexpectedly crisp afternoon, while sitting comfortably on the weathered wooden steps of the main house, Wilson meticulously carved a brilliant little wooden wagon for their wildly energetic toddler, desperately trying to replicate the massive freight carriages they frequently saw at the bustling Larkspur Junction station. When the intricately fashioned, tiny wooden steering mechanism abruptly snapped in the boy's eager, rough hands, causing a sudden cascade of dramatic, heartbroken tears, Wilson patiently knelt in the damp dirt to gently comfort him. He spent the entire fading evening carefully repairing the fragile wooden toy, meticulously binding the broken steering shaft with a tight, incredibly strong wrapping of waxed leather twine, entirely transforming the tragic break into a fiercely reinforced joint that would absolutely never shatter again. Mara quietly watched this tender, deeply profound interaction from the kitchen window, her heart swelling with an overwhelming, indescribable affection for the quiet, stoic man who instinctively knew exactly how to permanently fix broken things by making them infinitely stronger than they had ever been before. As the incredibly prosperous years rapidly multiplied, the Kincaid cattle operation brilliantly expanded far beyond its original modest borders, successfully absorbing two entirely abandoned neighboring properties that had tragically failed during the brutal droughts. Wilson intelligently utilized the surging financial profits to massively upgrade their vital infrastructure, aggressively building a remarkably modern, sprawling winter barn and continuously importing highly durable premium barbed wire directly from the industrial factories in the East. He essentially managed an expansive, highly complex agricultural network, routinely generating detailed, incredibly precise logistical schedules, and managing a completely isolated, highly independent crew of highly skilled, seasonal cowboys who fiercely respected his quiet, unyielding authority. Mara seamlessly acted as his incredibly brilliant operational partner, meticulously coordinating all of their complex financial transactions with the powerful regional banks in Wichita and aggressively negotiating incredibly lucrative long-term shipping contracts directly with the aggressive freight managers at the bustling Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. Together, they effectively transformed a relatively modest, wildly vulnerable frontier ranch into an absolute powerhouse of profound economic stability, brilliantly proving that their unexpected, beautiful union was not merely a romantic salvation, but an incredibly formidable, utterly unstoppable partnership. Their unprecedented, soaring success fundamentally altered their incredibly vital position within the rapidly expanding, wildly bustling community of Larkspur Junction, abruptly transforming them from isolated, quiet mourners into universally respected, immensely powerful civic leaders. When the rapidly growing, ambitious frontier town desperately needed immediate, substantial financial funding to finally construct a massive, incredibly sturdy brick schoolhouse for the exploding population of young, energetic prairie children, Wilson and Mara instantly provided the critical foundational capital without a single moment of hesitation. They fiercely believed that absolute, unyielding dedication to the broader community was the most profound, deeply meaningful way to actively honor the tragic, heartbreaking losses they had both personally endured in their painful, deeply scarred pasts. Mara deliberately organized a highly successful, incredibly massive regional agricultural fair that instantly drew hundreds of excited, completely overwhelmed families from across the sprawling territory, brilliantly utilizing her sharp, incredibly strategic mind to perfectly coordinate the incredibly complex, wildly chaotic logistics of the massive week-long celebration. Wilson proudly watched her effortlessly navigate the incredibly dense, overwhelming crowds, deeply marveling at the vibrant, wildly confident woman who had courageously stepped out of the isolating shadows of her own crippling, suffocating grief to brilliantly illuminate the entire sprawling prairie. On a surprisingly warm, deeply nostalgic Friday afternoon in late November, exactly 10 magnificent years after that incredibly transformative, profoundly transformative encounter in the freezing rain, Wilson and Mara deliberately returned to the bustling Larkspur Junction railway platform. The imposing, weathered cedar station house had been entirely repainted a bright, vibrant white, and the old, terribly scarred wooden benches had been permanently replaced with incredibly modern, highly polished iron seating, completely erasing the physical remnants of his desperate, agonizing vigils. They stood together near the bustling ticket window, softly smiling as they actively watched a brand-new, wildly anxious clerk frantically attempt to meticulously organize the chaotic, deeply overwhelming schedule board directly ahead of the massive afternoon arrival. When the mighty Baldwin locomotive finally screeched into the crowded station, aggressively belching its incredibly familiar, deeply comforting cloud of thick black coal smoke and violently sharp creosote, they instinctively reached out and firmly grasped each other's weathered hands. They didn't come to desperately wait for ghosts or to actively mourn the painful, deeply tragic past. They simply came to profoundly honor the exact, incredibly sacred physical space where their broken, entirely shattered lives had miraculously intersected and beautifully began to thoroughly heal. As they peacefully walked back toward their sturdy, incredibly reliable wagon through the rapidly cooling, deeply golden autumn twilight, Wilson spoke incredibly softly about Evelyn for the very first time in several incredibly busy, incredibly chaotic years. He clearly articulated that the painful, desperately agonizing edges of his profound, suffocating grief had finally completely worn away, beautifully leaving behind a deeply comforting, incredibly warm sense of profound gratitude for the vibrant, deeply loving years they had so beautifully shared. Mara listened incredibly intently, her heart swelling with an absolutely immense, entirely indescribable affection, completely devoid of any toxic, corrosive jealousy or lingering, suffocating insecurity regarding the beautiful, deeply cherished woman who had originally built the foundation of their magnificent home. She profoundly understood that the human heart possesses a truly infinite, completely boundless capacity to deeply love, and that beautifully honoring the profoundly sacred memory of the tragic past in no way violently diminished the incredible, blazing intensity of their beautiful, completely magnificent present. They were entirely, completely secure in the beautiful, brilliantly unyielding fortress of their shared, incredibly passionate existence, proudly standing together as an absolutely unbreakable, deeply formidable force against the harsh, terribly unforgiving Kansas frontier. The massive, incredibly sprawling Kincaid Ranch brilliantly stood as a truly magnificent, widely celebrated testament to the incredible, absolutely unstoppable power of profound resilience, wildly enduring through vicious storms and devastating droughts. As they quietly rode back up the long, winding dirt driveway, they could instantly see the warm, deeply inviting golden glow of the flickering oil lamps brilliantly illuminating the windows of their massive, beautifully expanded wooden farmhouse. Young William was already wildly sprinting across the wide, highly polished wooden porch, aggressively waving a beautifully carved wooden train and loudly shouting incredibly joyful, purely innocent greetings into the rapidly descending, deeply peaceful prairie night. Wilson gently pulled back on the heavy leather reins, bringing the incredibly powerful, massive draft horses to a beautifully smooth, incredibly graceful halt, and deeply turned to look directly into the vibrant, incredibly intelligent eyes of his magnificent, fiercely devoted wife. The terrifying, suffocating emptiness that had once completely defined his entirely shattered, profoundly broken soul was now completely, absolutely overflowing with an incredible, wildly uncontrollable abundance of brilliant, deeply profound joy and absolute, fiercely unyielding purpose. They had beautifully transformed a quiet legacy of solitary mourning into a vibrant, powerful empire of enduring love. The harsh, entirely unforgiving reality of the violent American frontier violently demanded absolute, completely unyielding strength, and together they possessed an incredible, entirely boundless reservoir of fiercely determined, absolutely unstoppable courage. They had successfully navigated the terrifying, deeply treacherous waters of profound, suffocating grief and miraculously arrived on a beautifully vibrant, incredibly prosperous shore, completely building a brilliant, completely undeniable masterpiece from the shattered, terribly broken fragments of their previous lives. Every single morning, when the brilliant, intensely blazing prairie sun triumphantly breached the distant, deeply rolling eastern horizon, it brilliantly illuminated a deeply magnificent, entirely unyielding family that had courageously chosen to bravely live instead of merely hopelessly waiting. Mara permanently kept a deeply cherished, incredibly old, completely faded platform ticket securely tucked away in a beautiful, highly polished wooden lockbox, deeply honoring the incredible, profoundly transformative leap of absolute, incredibly terrifying faith she had so bravely taken in the cold rain. It eternally served as a deeply profound, incredibly silent reminder that the most beautiful, entirely magnificent destinations in our complex, wildly unpredictable lives are completely discovered when we finally stop desperately waiting for the ghostly trains that will absolutely never arrive. When the incredibly brutal, deeply terrifying month of December aggressively descended upon the sprawling Kansas plains, the entire Kincaid family seamlessly shifted into a highly coordinated, incredibly efficient routine of massive, entirely vital winter preparations. Mara meticulously spent endless, deeply exhausting hours in the massive, brilliantly constructed root cellar, aggressively cataloguing hundreds of incredibly heavy, highly fragile glass jars entirely filled with beautifully preserved peaches, incredibly vibrant green beans, and deeply savory crushed tomatoes. Wilson and his fiercely loyal, incredibly dedicated ranch hands worked relentlessly from the freezing, violently dark dawn until the bitter, deeply freezing dusk, frantically moving the massive, incredibly valuable cattle herd into the deeply protected, incredibly secure southern ravines to completely shield them from the deadly wind. Young William constantly shadowed his incredibly powerful father, proudly wearing a tiny, beautifully tailored heavy wool coat and forcefully pretending to intelligently command the incredibly massive, highly intelligent working dogs with a truly adorable, deeply hilarious imitation of Wilson's deep, incredibly authoritative baritone. The entire incredibly vibrant homestead functioned as a truly brilliant, perfectly synchronized organism, deeply fueled by an incredible, entirely unbreakable bond of absolute, fiercely unyielding mutual devotion that completely defied the intensely punishing, violently harsh elements of the frozen, terribly desolate prairie. The highly anticipated, deeply joyful arrival of the vibrant Christmas season brilliantly transformed the massive, incredibly sturdy farmhouse into a truly magnificent, entirely breathtaking sanctuary of brilliant, intensely glowing warmth and completely uncontainable, wildly echoing laughter. Mara meticulously decorated the massive, deeply fragrant cedar tree they had aggressively dragged from the distant, deeply snow-covered northern ridge, beautifully stringing hundreds of incredibly delicate, highly polished dried berries and truly magnificent, carefully carved wooden ornaments across the vibrant, incredibly lush green branches. She also expertly roasted a massive, incredibly succulent wild turkey, beautifully filling the entire, completely bustling kitchen with the incredibly intoxicating, deeply rich aromas of wild sage, entirely fresh thyme, and deeply savory, highly complex, caramelized onions that completely overpowered the freezing chill outside. The entire, fiercely dedicated crew of exhausted, incredibly grateful ranch hands happily gathered around the incredibly massive, beautifully polished oak dining table, loudly sharing wildly exaggerated, deeply hilarious tales of the rugged, completely untamed frontier, while intensely devouring the incredibly magnificent, deeply comforting holiday feast. In these truly beautiful, profoundly vibrant moments of absolute, entirely unyielding communal joy, Wilson deeply realized that he had not merely simply survived his tragic, profoundly devastating past, but had miraculously managed to brilliantly orchestrate a truly magnificent, completely extraordinary new life. As the deeply peaceful, incredibly